Dr. Daniel Carter had been working on the space station above the planet Kepler 442b for 8 months now, and every day felt the same until the morning when everything changed. He was sitting in his small office reviewing medical reports when Lisa Morgan rushed through the door with an excited look on her face. She told him that a group of aliens called the Vrelnathi had just arrived, and they needed help with something important. Daniel had met many different alien species during his time on the station, but the Vrelnathi were new to him. Lisa explained that they looked like large insects and walked on 6 legs, and they had brought someone who needed medical attention. Daniel grabbed his medical scanner and followed Lisa to the main docking bay where the alien visitors were waiting. The Vrelnathi delegation stood in a small group near their ship, and Daniel could see they were nervous. Their bodies were covered in a blue-green shell that reflected the station lights, and their heads had large compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. The leader of the group was named Thexkal, and he spoke through a small translation device that hung around his neck. He greeted Daniel with respect and explained that they had traveled a long way because they heard that humans might be able to help them. Daniel asked what kind of help they needed, and that was when Thexkal stepped aside and a small Vrelnathi child moved forward from behind the adults. The child was named Zilkra, and she was only about 6 years old in human terms. Daniel noticed immediately that something was wrong with the way she moved. Most Vrelnathi walked smoothly on 6 legs, but Zilkra was limping badly and keeping her weight shifted to one side. Then Daniel saw why. The child was missing her back left leg, and the place where it should have been was just a scarred stump. Zilkra looked up at Daniel with her large compound eyes, and he could see fear and hope mixed together in her expression. Thexkal explained through his translator that Zilkra had lost her leg during their colony migration when a piece of equipment fell on her. Their doctors had tried to help her using their advanced regenerative medicine, but nothing worked. The injury had happened at a stage in her development when her body could no longer regrow lost limbs. Daniel knelt down slowly so he was at the same level as Zilkra, and he smiled at her, even though he was not sure if Vrelnathi understood human facial expressions. He asked Thexkal if he could run some medical scans, and the translator made clicking sounds as it converted his words. The adult Vrelnathi discussed this among themselves for a moment, and then Thexkal agreed. Daniel carefully moved his scanner over Zilkra's body, while Lisa recorded the data on her tablet. The young alien stood very still during the examination, but Daniel could see her injured leg trembling from the effort of standing without proper support. After finishing the scans, Daniel stood up and looked at the data on Lisa's tablet. The information was fascinating because even though Vrelnathi biology was very different from human biology, the basic neural structure in their limbs was actually simpler than what humans had. Daniel felt excitement building in his chest because he was starting to see a solution. He told Thexkal that he wanted to discuss something with his team and asked if the Vrelnathi could wait for a few hours. The aliens agreed and moved to a waiting area where station staff brought them food and water that was safe for their species. Daniel hurried back to his office with Lisa right behind him, and they immediately started analyzing the scan data in detail. Lisa was the first to say what they were both thinking. The Vrelnathi had been looking for a biological solution to Zilkra's problem, but what she really needed was not medicine or regeneration, but a prosthetic limb. Humans had been making artificial limbs for hundreds of years, going back to ancient times on Earth, and the technology had become incredibly advanced. Daniel pulled up files showing modern human prosthetics that connected directly to the nervous system and allowed users to control artificial limbs as naturally as real ones. The question was whether this technology could work for an alien species with completely different biology. Lisa studied the neural pathways in Zilkra's scans and compared them to human nerve structures. She pointed out that the Vrelnathi nervous system was actually less complex in the limbs than the human system, which meant it might be easier to create an interface, not harder. Daniel agreed and said they needed to bring Greg Palmer into this discussion. Greg was the station's chief engineer, and if anyone could build a custom prosthetic for an alien child, it was him. They called Greg to the office, and when he arrived, Daniel explained the situation. Greg looked at the scans and medical data for several minutes without saying anything, and Daniel started to worry that the engineer would say it was impossible. But then Greg smiled and said he could definitely build what they needed. The 3 of them spent the rest of the day planning and designing. Daniel focused on the neural interface that would connect the prosthetic to Zilkra's nervous system. Lisa worked on making sure all the materials would be safe for Vrilnathi biology and would not cause any rejection or infection. Greg started designing the actual mechanical leg using the station's advanced manufacturing equipment. They decided to make the prosthetic look similar to Zilkra's natural legs, with the same segmented structure and joints. Greg suggested they could even add decorative patterns to the metal surface to match the traditional markings that Vrilnathi had on their shells. 3 days passed in a blur of work. Daniel barely slept as he refined the neural interface design and ran simulation after simulation to make sure it would work correctly. Lisa tested every material they planned to use to ensure it was completely biocompatible with Vrilnathi tissue. Greg worked in the engineering bay using 3D printers and precision tools to craft each component of the prosthetic leg. The other station workers heard about the project, and many of them stopped by to watch or offer help. A materials scientist named Kevin Hayes helped Greg find the perfect lightweight alloy for the leg's frame. A neurologist named Helen Morris reviewed Daniel's interface design and suggested several improvements. Finally, on the evening of the 3rd day, the prosthetic was complete. Daniel stood in the medical bay holding the artificial leg and examining every detail. It was beautiful in its own way. The metal had been polished until it shone with the same blue-green color as Zilkra's natural shell. The joints moved smoothly and quietly. The decorative patterns Greg had etched into the surface matched traditional Vrilnathi designs that Thexcal had shown them. Most importantly, the neural interface at the top was ready to connect with Zilkra's nervous system and allow her to control the leg with just her thoughts. Daniel called the Vrilnathi delegation back to the medical bay, and when they arrived, he showed them what his team had created. Zilkra moved closer to look at the prosthetic leg lying on the examination table. Her antennae moved in what Daniel had learned was curiosity. Thexcal translated as Zilkra's parent Vexra spoke, and the words that came through the device were full of emotion. Vexra said the prosthetic was beautiful and asked if it would really work. Daniel explained honestly that they believed it would work, but they would not know for certain until they tried. He told them the surgery would take several hours and there were risks, as with any medical procedure. Vexra looked at Zilkra, and the young one made clicking sounds that the translator converted to a simple phrase. She said she wanted to try. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning. Daniel spent that night going over every step of the procedure in his mind. He had performed many surgeries on humans, but never on an alien species. The responsibility felt heavy on his shoulders. If something went wrong, it would not just hurt one child, but might damage the trust between humans and Vrilnathi. But he also knew that doing nothing was not an option. Zilkra deserved the chance to walk properly again. When morning came, Daniel put on his surgical gear and entered the operating room where Zilkra was already waiting on the table. Lisa was there to monitor vital signs, and Greg stood ready with tools in case any adjustments were needed on the prosthetic. Daniel looked down at the small alien child who trusted him to help her, and he made a silent promise that he would do everything in his power to give her back her mobility. The surgery took 6 hours, and Daniel's hands never shook once during the entire procedure. He carefully opened the tissue at Zilkra's stump and identified each nerve cluster that would need to connect to the prosthetic interface. Lisa called out vital signs every few minutes, and each time she reported that Zilkra was stable and doing well. Greg watched through the observation window, ready to rush in if any modifications were needed on the prosthetic leg itself. Daniel worked slowly and precisely, connecting the tiny neural interface ports to the corresponding nerve endings in Zilkra's body. Each connection had to be perfect, or the prosthetic would not respond correctly to her thoughts. When the final connection was complete, Daniel stepped back and took a deep breath. Now came the moment of truth. He activated the neural interface and watched the small lights on the prosthetic leg turn from red to green, indicating that power was flowing and the system was online. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Daniel felt his heart sink. Then Zilkra's new leg twitched slightly. The movement was small, but it was there. Daniel asked Lisa to reduce the anesthesia slowly so Zilkra could wake up, while still in the controlled environment of the operating room. Zilkra's compound eyes opened gradually, and she looked around in confusion. Thexcal spoke to her through the translator in their own language, explaining where she was and what had happened. The young Vrilnathi made clicking sounds, and then suddenly her attention focused on her new leg. Daniel watched as she concentrated, and the prosthetic leg moved again, this time with clear purpose. The joints bent and extended smoothly. Zilkra made an excited chittering sound that needed no translation. Within minutes, she was moving the prosthetic leg as naturally as her other limbs. Daniel helped Zilkra sit up on the operating table, and then with support from both him and Lisa, the young alien stood on all 6 legs. For the first time in many months, tears formed in Daniel's eyes as he watched her take a tentative step forward and then another. Zilkra was wobbling slightly as her brain adjusted to having 6 legs again, but she was walking. Then, before anyone could stop her, she began to run around the medical bay. Her chittering laughter filled the room, and Vexra made a sound so full of joy and relief that it transcended the need for any translation device. The Vrelnathi family stayed on the station for another week while Daniel monitored Zilkra's recovery and made small adjustments to the prosthetic's calibration. By the end of the week, Zilkra was running and playing as if she had never lost her leg at all. When it came time for them to leave, Thexcal asked Daniel how much payment was required for the medical service. Daniel looked at the hopeful faces of the Vrelnathi family, and he thought about his own childhood and the importance of simply being able to play and run like other kids. He told them there was no charge because Zilkra was just a child and children should be able to run. Thexcal translated this, and the entire Vrelnathi delegation seemed shocked. They insisted they must pay something, but Daniel refused. Finally, Vexra approached Daniel and touched his hand with one of her legs, which Lisa later explained was a gesture of deep respect and gratitude in Vrelnathi culture. 3 months passed, and Daniel returned to his normal routine of research and occasional medical consultations. He thought about Zilkra sometimes and hoped she was doing well, but he never expected to hear about her again. Then one morning, his communication terminal started beeping urgently. Daniel answered it and found himself looking at the face of Ambassador Chen Wei from the United Earth Diplomatic Corps. The ambassador's expression was serious, and Daniel immediately worried that he had violated some kind of protocol by treating an alien patient without proper authorization. Ambassador Chen Wei spoke quickly, telling Daniel that they needed to talk about what he had done for the Vrelnathi child. Daniel started to explain his reasoning, but the ambassador interrupted him with a smile. She told him he had not done anything wrong, but rather he had created what she called a diplomatic incident of the very best kind. Daniel was confused until the ambassador switched the video feed to show him news reports from across the galaxy. His confusion turned to complete shock as he saw his own face and images of Zilkra on news networks from dozens of different alien species. The story of the human doctor who had helped a Vrelnathi child had spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Video footage of Zilkra running and playing on her prosthetic leg had been shared millions of times across alien social networks. Species that had never paid much attention to Earth were suddenly asking questions about human medical technology. Ambassador Chen Wei explained that the Galactic Council had received formal inquiries from more than 20 different species, asking about prosthetics and other assistive devices. Daniel sat down heavily in his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. Kevin Hayes burst into Daniel's office holding a tablet filled with incoming messages. He explained that the station's communication system was being flooded with requests from across the galaxy. There were messages from Kaltorian scientists asking about prosthetics for birth defects that their regenerative medicine could not fix. There were inquiries from Yorgathi doctors about mobility aids for paralysis. There were questions from species Daniel had never even heard of asking if human technology could help with blindness or deafness or chronic pain conditions. Kevin said there were already more than 200 messages and more were arriving every minute. Lisa ran into the office moments later with her own tablet showing similar data. She had been researching the alien news networks and found that journalists from multiple species were running special features about human adaptive engineering. One Plexian reporter had written an entire article about Earth's history of creating solutions for people with disabilities. The article pointed out that most species in the galaxy had focused on biological fixes through genetic engineering or regenerative medicine, but humans had taken a different path. When biology could not be fixed, humans had learned to work around it with mechanical and electronic aids. Greg joined them, looking overwhelmed and excited at the same time. He said the engineering community across several species was buzzing with interest in human manufacturing techniques for prosthetics and medical devices. Some alien engineers were already trying to replicate human designs for their own people. Greg showed them a video from a Kaltorian engineer who had successfully created a prosthetic arm based on publicly available human schematics, and the Kaltorian was praising human ingenuity and generous sharing of knowledge. Ambassador, Chenwei called again, and this time she had more concrete information. The United Earth government was organizing a formal response to all the galactic interest. They were putting together teams of doctors and engineers and therapists to travel to various locations in the galaxy and offer consultations. The ambassador said Daniel would be leading one of these teams if he was willing. She explained that this was an unprecedented opportunity for Earth to establish itself as a valuable member of the galactic community, not through military power or economic strength, but through compassion and innovation. Daniel looked at Lisa and Greg and Kevin and saw the same excitement and nervousness in their faces that he felt himself. This was so much bigger than he had ever imagined. He had just wanted to help one child walk again. Now he was being asked to help shape how humanity interacted with the entire galaxy. The responsibility felt enormous, but Daniel knew he could not say no. If there were others out there like Zilkra who needed help, then he had an obligation to try. Over the next few weeks, the station became a hub of activity. Earth sent additional medical personnel and equipment. Alien representatives started arriving to observe and learn about human adaptive technology. Daniel gave presentations to groups of alien doctors explaining the principles behind prosthetics and neural interfaces. Greg held workshops on manufacturing techniques. Lisa taught courses on biocompatibility and material science. The small research station that had been Daniel's quiet workplace for 8 months had transformed into something resembling a medical school. The first major case beyond Zilkra arrived on a Tuesday morning. A Kaltorian family brought their son named Drex, who had been born with a genetic condition that prevented his left arm from forming properly. The Kaltorians were a crystalline species, and their bodies were made of living mineral structures. Drex's arm had never crystallized correctly and hung as a malformed partial limb. Kaltorian medicine had tried everything, but genetic conditions built into the very structure of his crystalline matrix could not be changed. Daniel examined Drex carefully and consulted with a Kaltorian physician who had accompanied the family. Together they worked out how to create a prosthetic that would interface with a crystalline nervous system rather than an organic one. Greg designed an arm that incorporated synthetic crystals grown in the station's lab. The prosthetic arm was carefully faceted to catch and reflect light, just like natural Kaltorian limbs. When they attached it to Drex and activated the neural interface, the young Kaltorian's entire body resonated with a frequency that the translation software labeled as profound joy. Drex's parents offered to pay with rare minerals, worth a fortune, but Lisa gently refused the payment. She told them to use those resources to help other Kaltorians who might need similar. The success with Drex brought even more attention to the human medical station, and not all of it was positive. Daniel was in the middle of fitting a young Yorgathi named Threx with a spinal support brace when the station's security officer called to warn him that an important diplomatic visitor had arrived unannounced. Before Daniel could ask who it was, the doors to the medical bay slid open, and a towering figure entered the room. The being stood nearly 8 feet tall with smooth amphibian-like skin that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns glowing across its body. Daniel recognized the species immediately as Krell and felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. The Krell were the most advanced medical civilization in the galaxy, and their bioregenerative technology was considered the ultimate standard that all other species tried to achieve. For 3,000 years, the Krell hegemony had dominated galactic medicine, and their techniques were used by dozens of species across hundreds of worlds. The visitors' bioluminescent patterns were pulsing an aggressive orange color, and Daniel did not need a translator to understand that this Krell was not happy. The being introduced himself as Ambassador Krellnax, and his voice was deep and resonant like rolling thunder. Ambassador Krellnax looked at young Threx, who was standing nervously in his new spinal support brace, and the Krell's patterns flickered with what seemed like disgust. The ambassador declared loudly that what the humans were doing was primitive and barbaric. He said that attaching metal and plastic to living beings like crude machinery was not real medicine, but rather an insult to the very concept of healing. Daniel felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He carefully finished securing the last strap on Threx's brace and ran a final diagnostic check before turning to face the Krell ambassador. Daniel asked the ambassador quietly if the spinal brace looked barbaric to Threx. He gestured to the young Yorgathi, who was now standing upright for the first time in his life. Threx had been born with a genetic defect that left him paralyzed in his lower body, and Krell Regenerative Medicine had examined him and declared his condition irreparable. The young one's parents were making happy chittering sounds in their own language as they watched their son stand and take his first shaky steps. Ambassador Krellnax looked at the family, but his patterns remained an angry orange. The Krell ambassador continued his criticism, saying that humans were preying on desperate people who had no other options. He claimed that humans were offering false hope with mechanical devices that would eventually break down and fail. He asked who would repair these devices when they malfunctioned, and suggested that the users would be worse off than before, when the technology inevitably let them down. Daniel felt his jaw clench tight, but before he could respond, Greg stepped forward with his arms crossed. The engineer explained firmly that every single prosthetic they built came with complete technical schematics and detailed repair instructions. They were also training local technicians from each species on maintenance and repair procedures. Greg said they were not creating dependence, but rather sharing knowledge and technology freely. Ambassador Krellnax's patterns shifted to a skeptical purple color. He said that humans always claimed benevolence, but he knew Earth's history. He pointed out that humanity's home planet had been fractured and violent and desperate before humans reached the stars. The ambassador suggested that this whole program was just a clever ploy by Earth to gain political influence and power in the galactic community. Lisa's eyes flashed with anger at this accusation, and she opened her mouth to respond. But Daniel held up his hand, asking her to wait. Daniel took a deep breath and admitted that Ambassador Krellnax was right about Earth's history. He explained that Earth had indeed been fractured with wars and inequality and tremendous suffering. But he said that was exactly why humans had developed adaptive technology in the first place. Daniel described how Earth had millions of people who needed help, and human medicine could not always fix the biological problems they faced. So humans learned to work with disabilities rather than just trying to cure them. They developed tools and devices that let people live full and meaningful lives even with their physical limitations. Ambassador Krellnax interrupted, saying that limitations should be overcome and not simply accommodated. His patterns were still showing skepticism and dismissal. Daniel looked the tall ambassador in his large eyes and asked a simple question. He asked what the Krell did when their advanced medicine failed. He asked what happened when regeneration did not work, and when genetic therapy was impossible, and when biological solutions simply could not address a problem. The question seemed to catch the ambassador off guard, and his bioluminescent patterns flickered rapidly through several colors, showing confusion and uncertainty. There was a long silence in the medical bay. Finally, Ambassador Krellnax spoke much more quietly than before. He admitted that the Krell did their best with the tools they had. His patterns had shifted to a dim blue color that Daniel's database suggested indicated discomfort or shame. Daniel nodded and said simply that humans did their best too, but with different tools. He explained that the goal was the same for both species, which was helping people who were suffering. The methods might be different, but the intention was identical. The tension in the room was broken unexpectedly when young Threx walked over to where Ambassador Krellnax was standing. The small Yorgothi had to look way up to see the tall Krell's face. Threx spoke in his own chittering language, and the translation device converted his words. The young one thanked the ambassador for trying to help him. He said that Krell doctors had been kind and had tried many treatments, but nothing had worked. Then he said that the human doctors had been able to help him with their different approach. Threx finished by saying that both the Krell and the humans were good, and he was grateful to everyone who had tried to help him. Something changed in Ambassador Krellnax at that moment. His bioluminescent pattern slowly shifted from blue to a soft green color that Daniel's database indicated meant thoughtfulness or reconsideration. The ambassador knelt down to Threx's level, which was quite a sight given how tall the Krell was. He looked at the spinal support brace with new attention, studying how it was designed and how it connected to the young Yorgothi's body. After a long moment, Ambassador Krellnax asked Daniel if he could examine the device more closely. What followed was several hours of detailed technical discussion. Daniel walked the Krell ambassador through their entire process from initial diagnosis to final fitting. He showed Krellnax the neural interface technology and explained the material science that made their prosthetics both durable and lightweight. He demonstrated the customization process that made each device unique to its specific user. Greg showed the ambassador their manufacturing techniques and the precision required to create prosthetics that would last for years. Lisa explained their rehabilitation protocols and how they helped patients adjust to using their new devices. Ambassador Krelnax was silent for a long time after the presentation ended. His pattern cycled through several colors before finally settling on a steady green that indicated respect. He said that he had come to the station expecting to find charlatans taking advantage of desperate people. Instead, he found dedicated scientists who had solved problems that his own people had never even considered. The ambassador admitted that Krell medicine could regrow limbs, but only if the genetic template was intact and undamaged. They could cure many diseases, but only if the biology allowed for intervention. He asked what the Krell were supposed to do when their vaunted biological solutions simply did not apply. Lisa spoke up, saying that biology and engineering were not opposites, but rather complementary approaches. She suggested that the Krell and humans could learn from each other. The Krell had 3,000 years of medical advancement that humans could benefit from, and humans had centuries of adaptive engineering that might fill gaps in Krell capabilities. Ambassador Krelnax considered this, and his patterns brightened with what seemed like excitement. Before the ambassador left the station, he made a formal request to establish an exchange program between Krell bioscientists and human adaptive engineers. He said that his people had much to learn from humanity's approach to medical challenges. The request was a diplomatic victory, but more importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how the Krell hegemony viewed human medicine. If the galaxy's premier medical civilization was willing to learn from humans, then other species would feel more comfortable doing the same. News of Ambassador Krelnax's visit and his endorsement of human adaptive technology spread quickly through galactic communication networks. The trickle of requests for human medical assistance became a flood. Species that had been hesitant before now reached out eagerly, but with greater visibility came greater scrutiny, and not everyone in the galaxy was pleased with Earth's rising prominence in medical matters. 6 weeks after Ambassador Krelnax's visit, Daniel received a message that made his hands shake as he read it. The message came directly from the Galactic Council headquarters, and it was an official summons requesting his presence at a full assembly meeting. Lisa found him staring at his computer screen with a pale face, and she asked what was wrong. Daniel showed her the message and watched as her eyes went wide with shock. The Galactic Council was the governing body, where representatives from 300 different civilizations met to debate policy and set standards for how species interacted with each other. The council chambers orbited a neutral planet called Axios Prime, and Daniel had never imagined he would see the place in person, let alone speak before the entire assembly. Ambassador Chen Wei arrived at the station 2 days later to brief Daniel on what to expect. She brought with her Director Helen Morris, who led Earth's Medical Diplomatic Corps. The three of them sat in Daniel's office while Helen explained that multiple species had submitted formal proposals to the council regarding human adaptive technology. Some species wanted to regulate how humans shared their medical knowledge. Others wanted to mandate that Earth establish training programs across the galaxy. There were proposals to create standards and certifications and a whole framework of rules around adaptive engineering. Ambassador Chen Wei's face was serious as she added that some species wanted to ban human adaptive technology entirely. Daniel felt his stomach drop at those words. He asked why anyone would want to ban technology that was helping people. Helen explained that there were several reasons. Some species feared that too many people would become dependent on human technology, giving Earth too much influence. Others worried about what they called cultural imperialism, where human approaches to disability might override traditional beliefs of other species. There were economic concerns from civilizations whose medical industries might be disrupted by human competition. Helen also mentioned a philosophical faction that believed adapting to disability rather than curing it was fundamentally wrong and unethical. The trip to Axios Prime took 3 days by faster-than-light transport. Daniel spent most of that time preparing his presentation with help from Lisa and Greg, who had been allowed to accompany him. They reviewed thousands of case files and technical documents, trying to anticipate every possible question the council might ask. Daniel barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with images of hostile alien representatives shouting accusations at him. On the morning they arrived at the council chambers, Daniel felt sick with nervousness. The council building was massive beyond anything Daniel had imagined. It was a rotating ring structure in orbit around Axios Prime, and the main assembly hall was large enough to hold representatives from 300 species, along with their staff and observers. As Daniel walked through the entrance hallway with Lisa and Greg flanking him, he could see aliens of every imaginable type. There were crystalline beings that looked like walking gemstones. There were floating gas clouds contained in magnetic fields. There were mechanical beings that might have been robots or might have been living creatures made of metal. The diversity was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. They were led to a preparation room where they could see the assembly hall through a large window. The hall was arranged like an amphitheater, with seats rising in tiers that seemed to go up forever into the shadows of the ceiling. Every seat was filling with alien representatives and their various attendants. Daniel estimated there must be 10,000 beings in the hall. Greg whispered that his hands were sweating, and Lisa admitted she felt like she might throw up. Daniel wanted to tell them he felt the same way, but he was supposed to be the leader, so he tried to look calm even though his heart was racing. A tall, Kaltorian attendant entered the preparation room and informed them it was time. The doors opened and suddenly Daniel was walking into the assembly hall with thousands of alien eyes and sensors and other perception organs all turning to focus on him. The walk to the central platform felt like it took forever. When Daniel finally reached the speaking platform, he looked up at the tiers of seats surrounding him and felt incredibly small. The hall fell silent, and the quiet was somehow more intimidating than noise would have been. Krell, named Vex Theon, who served as council arbiter, spoke in a formal tone that translator devices converted into hundreds of different languages simultaneously. The arbiter explained that Daniel stood accused of nothing, but was present to answer questions about human medical practices that had caused significant discussion among member species. Vexithion asked Daniel to help the council understand what humans were doing and why they were doing it. Daniel had prepared a formal speech, but standing there in that enormous hall looking at thousands of alien faces, he decided to throw away his notes. Instead, he simply told Zilkra's story. He described meeting a frightened child who could not walk properly, and how his team had used old human technology to give her a prosthetic leg. He explained that humans were not trying to replace anyone's medicine or claim superiority over other species. They were simply offering an alternative approach for situations when traditional biological medicine did not work. Daniel said that every species in the galaxy had individuals who fell through the cracks of even the best medical systems, and humans were trying to help those people. A representative from the Thex coalition stood up abruptly. The being looked like a large praying mantis, and its voice was sharp and clicking. The representative asked how Daniel justified changing how individuals existed and making them dependent on technology that only humans could produce. The question sounded accusatory, and Daniel felt his face flush with anger, but he kept his voice steady as he answered. Before he could finish his response, Greg stepped forward and spoke up. The engineer explained firmly that humans provided complete technical specifications for every device they created. They trained local technicians in manufacturing and repair. The goal was not to create dependence, but to transfer knowledge and capability so that any species with basic manufacturing could produce adaptive devices themselves. Another representative stood up, and this one was a shimmering energy field, contained in what looked like a bottle made of light. The being identified itself as part of a philosophical collective, and asked whether it was better to accept one's limitations with dignity rather than alter oneself with crude machinery. The question implied that using prosthetics was somehow shameful or wrong. Lisa's response was immediate, and her voice cut through the hall like a knife. She asked the philosophical collective representative if they had ever watched a child cry because they could not play with friends. She asked if they had seen a parent's desperation when every medical option failed. Lisa said that dignity did not come from accepting limitations, but from having the freedom to choose one's own path. The assembly hall erupted into chaos. Hundreds of representatives began speaking at once in their various languages, and the translator system struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations. Some aliens seemed to be arguing with each other, while others were shouting questions at Daniel and his team. Council Arbiter Vexithion called for order, but the debate continued. For 3 hours, the council questioned and argued and discussed. Daniel answered every question as honestly as he could. He showed holographic examples of their work. He explained their processes and defended their philosophy. His throat was raw from talking and his legs ached from standing, but he refused to show weakness. Then something happened that Daniel had not expected. The main doors of the assembly hall opened and a group of beings entered, who were not on the official schedule. Daniel's heart jumped when he recognized Zilkra walking confidently on all 6 legs with her prosthetic gleaming under the hall's lights. Behind her came Drex the Kaltorian, and Threx the Yorgathi and dozens of other individuals that human adaptive technology had helped. Following them were their families and their doctors and representatives from their home communities. The group filled the floor of the council chamber, and their presence seemed to silence the debate more effectively than any call for order. Zilkra approached the central platform where Daniel stood. She was no longer the frightened child he had first met, but a confident young being who knew her own worth. Her translator device converted her chittering speech into words that filled the massive hall. She introduced herself and explained that before the humans helped her, she could not run or play or imagine a future beyond her limitations. She said that humans had not just given her a prosthetic leg, but had given her hope and possibility. She finished by saying that she wanted to become an engineer herself someday, so she could help others the way humans had helped her. One by one, the others spoke. Drex talked about how his crystalline prosthetic arm allowed him to create art, which had been impossible before. Threx's parent described the joy of watching their child walk for the first time. An elderly Kaltorian explained how a human-designed hearing device let her hear her grandchildren's voices after centuries of silence. Each story was personal and powerful, and together they painted a picture that no amount of debate could argue against. The council chamber remained silent for several long moments after the last testimony ended. Daniel watched as thousands of alien representatives looked at each other and at the group of individuals standing on the chamber floor. Finally, Ambassador Krelnax rose from his seat, and his bioluminescent patterns blazed bright green. The Krell ambassador's voice was strong and clear as he addressed the full assembly. He admitted that he had once been skeptical of human methods and had believed the Krell way was the only proper approach to medicine. He said he had been wrong, and that humans had not diminished medicine but rather expanded it. Krelnax made a formal motion that Earth be granted full medical research partner status and that human adaptive technologies be recognized as a legitimate branch of galactic medicine. The vote was called, and Daniel held his breath as the results appeared on the holographic displays throughout the chamber. The motion passed with strong support, though not unanimous approval. Some species still had reservations, but the majority had been convinced. Council Arbiter Vexion announced that the Galactic Council would establish a new program called the Adaptive Technology Integration Initiative, with Earth leading a coalition of species dedicated to helping those whom traditional medicine could not serve. The announcement was met with applause and various alien sounds of approval that translator devices struggled to categorize. As the formal session ended, representatives from dozens of species approached Daniel wanting to discuss collaboration and partnerships. A Plexian scientist wanted to adapt human prosthetic technology for their species' unique anatomy. A group of Yorgathi engineers offered to help establish manufacturing facilities on their worlds. Several species offered to share their own medical advances with Earth in exchange for adaptive technology training. Daniel felt overwhelmed by the attention, but also deeply grateful. What had started as one doctor helping one child had grown into something that might change the entire galaxy. The trip back to the station took another 3 days, and Daniel spent most of that time responding to messages and planning next steps. By the time they arrived home, the United Earth government had already begun mobilizing resources. They were sending teams of doctors and engineers and therapists to multiple locations across the galaxy. They were establishing consultation centers and training facilities. Earth was committing serious resources to this new initiative, and Daniel found himself at the center of it all, whether he wanted to be or not. 6 months passed in a blur of activity. Daniel barely recognized his life anymore. The small research station where he had worked in quiet isolation was now bustling with visitors from across the galaxy. Earth had built a major new facility on Luna, dedicated entirely to adaptive medicine, and Daniel found himself traveling there frequently to help set up programs and train new staff. The Adaptive Medicine Institute, as it was called, was a joint venture between Earth and 23 other species who had contributed resources and personnel. On a clear morning, Daniel stood in one of the Institute's wide observation rooms looking out at Earth hanging in the black sky. The planet looked peaceful and beautiful from this distance. It was hard to believe that humanity had only reached the stars a few generations ago. Now they were helping shape the future of galactic medicine. Lisa joined him at the window holding a datapad with the latest progress reports. She showed him numbers that seemed almost impossible. In just 6 months, their collaborative programs had helped over 10,000 individuals across 40 different species. The numbers kept growing as more facilities came online and more species joined the initiative. Greg arrived with his own good news. He had just finished training a group of Plexian engineers who had proven to be remarkably talented at adaptive design. Greg said that within another month the Plexians would be creating their own adaptations specifically suited to their people's needs without requiring any human assistance. That was exactly what Daniel had hoped for. The goal was never to make other species dependent on Earth, but rather to share knowledge so widely that everyone benefited. The Institute's main entrance doors opened, and a tour group entered. Daniel smiled when he saw Zilkra leading the group. The young Vrilnati had become a youth ambassador for the Adaptive Technology Program, and she took her role seriously. She was explaining to a diverse group of students how human adaptive technology worked and why it was important. Daniel listened as Zilkra told the students that humans had shown the galaxy something valuable. She said that humans had learned to be creative because their own history forced them to solve problems in unconventional ways. When they could not change biology, they changed their tools instead. A young Kaltorian in the tour group asked Zilkra if humans could help everyone. The student's crystalline arm was malformed and he looked hopeful, but also scared of disappointment. Zilkra answered honestly, saying that humans could not help everyone, but they tried their best. She explained that when humans could not solve a problem alone, they found other species who could contribute their expertise. The real lesson, she said, was that people were stronger when they worked together and shared their different ways of thinking. Ambassador Chen Wei arrived at the Institute for the official dedication ceremony. The event had been planned for weeks and representatives from 70 planets were attending either in person or via holographic transmission. Daniel had been dreading the ceremony because he hated giving speeches, but there was no way to avoid it this time. The auditorium was packed with dignitaries and scientists and medical professionals from across the galaxy. When it was finally Daniel's turn to speak, he walked to the podium, feeling every eye in the room focused on him. Daniel began by saying he was a doctor, not a politician, so he would keep his remarks simple. He told the audience that 6 months ago he had helped a child who needed a prosthetic leg. He explained that he did what any decent person would do, which was help because he could, and because it was right. What happened afterward had surprised him. The galaxy noticed not because humans did something extraordinary, but because they did something necessary. Daniel said that humans filled a gap that existed in galactic medicine, but that every species present had their own gaps and blind spots created by their own history and evolution. He explained that the Krell were masters of biological regeneration, but had never needed mechanical solutions. The Kaltorians understood crystalline structures better than anyone, but carbon-based biology was foreign to them. Humans developed adaptive technology out of necessity, not because they were special. Daniel looked out at the diverse audience and said that the Institute was not about humans teaching the galaxy. It was about everyone teaching each other. The real breakthrough was not the technology itself, but the collaboration and the recognition that differences made everyone stronger when they chose to work together. The applause was loud and enthusiastic, but Daniel barely heard it. He was watching Zilkra in the audience, sitting next to the young Kaltorian from the tour group. The two were talking excitedly, comparing their prosthetic limbs, and Daniel could see them already planning what they might accomplish together. That simple moment of connection between two young beings from different species meant more to him than any formal recognition or political achievement. After the ceremony, Daniel returned to his office feeling exhausted but satisfied. On his desk was a message from Vexra telling him that the Vrilnathi had established their own program to support young ones with disabilities, using human adaptive technology as a foundation but adapting it to Vrilnathi cultural values. They were taking the knowledge and making it their own, which was exactly what Daniel had hoped would happen. Other species were doing the same thing, creating their own versions and innovations based on the principles humans had shared. Kevin knocked on the door frame and told Daniel about several new incoming requests. A species called the Viridians wanted to know if human hearing augmentation could work for their unique auditory system. A Plexian research team wanted to collaborate on developing adaptive technology for deep space environments. A collective of synthetic beings was proposing an exchange program for their engineers. Daniel listened to the list and felt a mix of excitement and overwhelm. The work would never really be finished, because there would always be someone who needed help. Daniel told Kevin to set up meetings for all the new requests and to make sure they included the Krell bioscientists in the Viridian consultation, because their auditory regeneration research might be relevant. As Kevin left to make arrangements, Daniel looked out his window at Earth. Humanity had reached for the stars, hoping to find their place among the civilizations of the galaxy. They found that place not through conquest or trade, but through compassion and innovation born from their own struggles on a difficult world. The Galactic Medical Council sent another message proposing a galaxy-wide database of adaptive technologies that would be freely accessible to all species. They wanted Earth and the Krell hegemony to co-administer the database. Daniel approved the proposal and added his own suggestion to make it completely open source, allowing any species to contribute their own innovations. The goal was not to control the technology, but to spread it as widely as possible to ensure that no one anywhere in the galaxy